This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
Well, thank you so much for the lovely introduction, also for having me. I'm quite excited to present here and to hear also what you're thinking about, because I think most of the time I've just presented this work to philosophers of mind coming from a very specific kind of tradition. So it's always really nice to see how certain kind of developments come from one area or one discussion and then actually might bleed into others. So I'm trying to share my screen, and I hope that you should now be able to also see my screen. Perfect. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about the construction of a phenomenal space for pain experiences. And my agenda, what I want to go through with you today is first, I want to give a bit of background on debates in philosophy of pain, because rather coming from philosophy of mind debates concerning the phenomena of pain, one might ask, which role do phenomenal spaces even play here? So why should we be interested in phenomenal spaces coming from these kinds of debates? And I want to motivate this a bit for you. Then in the second step, I want to say a bit about constructing a phenomenal space for pain or for pain experiences and how this might look like. In the third step, I want to then also question certain aspects of it. So if it really is doing the job that a lot of philosophers were hoping that this kind of phenomenal spaces are doing for us. And I will discuss implications for philosophical debates, but also, for example, for the scientific use of it. So let's dive into the current debates in philosophy of pain. And I mean, like most philosophers, we're here starting with the question of what is X, and we're just asking here, what is pain? And there has been a lot of debate on this, especially starting off with how we use the term pain in everyday language. So there's a massive debate on that. So especially how we use the term in our everyday life. And I think by now we are roughly in the debates at a stage where people accept that maybe our everyday concept is complex or even ambivalent. So sometimes we use the term to paint about body states. So for example, a broken bone. And that we also use it to talk about a mental state, especially a conscious subjective experience. And this is what most philosophers, so the second meaning is what most philosophers, scientists, and also clinical professionals are actually interested in. So this is the kind of meaning of the term pain that we're going to focus on here. So in this sense, when we talk about pain, we talk about pain experiences. So I'm going to use this synonymously for the rest of this talk. And I think that most people are actually also agreeing more or less to the characterization of pain that the International Association for the Study of Pain has been giving us. This is one of the definitions from 2016 and has been updated in some of its finer details also in 2019. But the rough idea is that pain is understood as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with or resembling that associated with actual potential tissue damage. So first of all, it's a subjective experience we're interested in, and it has typically sensory aspects. So we experience as having a certain location and certain qualities to different degrees. And it typically has like a certain unpleasant aspect to it. So a certain kind of negative affective valence, at least characteristically is this what we find in pain experiences. And they might be caused by tissue damage. This is like what we expect in everyday life, but it does not necessarily have to be caused by that. So that's a rough characterization most people start off with. Now, philosophers, however, in the philosophy of mind, actually are looking even for something a bit more, right? If they say, oh, we are interested in pain as a subjective experience, they mean a group of subjective experience with a very specific kind of feeling of what it is like to undergo them, that they are looking for a specific kind of pain quality that makes pain experiences and not experiences of fear, anger, joy, hunger, itch, or something like this. We find this most famously in Saul Kripke's work, where he writes pain is not picked out by one of its accidental properties, rather it's picked out by the property of being pain itself, by its immediate phenomenological quality. Or Colin Klein, in more recent work, writing, if there's anything that's typical of all pains, I say it is that they feel like pains. This is how you identify them. And this is what in the debate has been called the orthodoxy of simplicity. At least this is how Jennifer Korns phrased this term for this group of authors who believe that there's a certain type similarity in phenomenal character across pains and a type difference between pains and non-pains that directly is accessible from a first-person perspective. So to us, pains feel a certain way that's different from all other kinds of experiences. And this is due to the fact that there is a certain kind of pain quality. Now, in 2020, with her book, The Complex Reality of Pain, but also in other papers, especially Jennifer Korns has criticized this orthodoxy of simplicity that seemed to be quite just generally accepted. And she says the problem is that we don't seem to find a good candidate for what this pain quality should actually be. And in a second, I will tell the argument that she's providing for that. But to give, so to say, as the general outlook, I think that there is, or the reasons she's providing is not sufficient reason to reject the orthodoxy of simplicity altogether. But what she's clearly showing to us is that for a long time, we've just postulated this pain quality without actually questioning what this pain quality should be. And we definitely need an answer to this question in order, so to say, to further along with the debate, if we want to start off with the idea, oh, there is not pain and they are defined by a specific kind of how they feel like, because quite often this is the definition of our research phenomena that we start off with then to do further investigation. So it's quite critical of how we define this reference class we're interested in when talking about pain. Now, the main problem seems to be the so-called heterogeneity problem. So the heterogeneity problem does not only emerge for pain, it's in general is a challenge to identify a single quality that characterizes a certain type of experience, which has variable instantiations. And at first glance, this seems to be the case for pain as well. So on the right hand here, you see the McGill pain questionnaire that we're going to work with here a bit. Because this is a standard instrument for people to report on their experience of pain that is used worldwide. It has been translated into various kind of languages. And typically people here indicate the location of their pain, but they also have a selection of sensory and affective adjectives that they can choose from. So for example, you have pricking, drilling, stabbing, lancinating in the group 3, which is like typical different ways in which pains can be described on the sensory level. Or you have in the group 16, for example, annoying, troublesome, miserable, which are characterizations of rather affective aspects of pain experiences. And now Coninx is rightfully saying, like, look, none of this could be the pain quality because every single of these properties is not common to all pains. So we might have some pains that are pricking, but some that are not. There might be some pains that we consider unbearable, but I mean, if I have like a light headache, then it's not unbearable. It might not be the affective adjective I'm using to describe it. So if we really assume that the orthodoxy of simplicity has to claim pain is identical to any of these adjectives, then this obviously we don't have a plausible candidate for what our pain quality could look like. Now, the thing is that this understanding is overly simplistic and need not be accepted by defenders of the orthodox view. So they actually have more attractive opportunities of how to define what a pain quality is. And the most common way in which, for instance, Sam Coleman or Colin Klein is doing this is what's called the determinable view. So their idea is that pain is a determinable of which each instance of pain is a determinate. And just for illustration, the same idea goes to color. So color is a determinable, and then we have multiple instances, different ways of being a color, which are the determinants of it. So red is a determinate of the determinable color, yellow is a determinate of the determinable color, and so on. And the idea is that maybe the same just applies to pain, right? So pains are just the individuals that pain instances that we can describe by means of the adjectives from McGill pain questionnaire. Maybe these are just different ways of being pain, where pain is like color and like a specific aching, burning pain maybe is a little bit more like crimson, for example. And this is also how the defenders of the determinable view try to solve the problem of heterogeneity. So for instance, Sam Coleman writes, some color experiences arguably have something literal in common. Experiences of red and orange, for instance, but many, perhaps most, do not. Experience of blue and red, for instance. So there's no determinate quality unit that all color experiences have in common. Nonetheless, we know directly on the basis of experience whether we are having a color experience and which one we are having. And this is because color experiences have proprietary and distinct qualitative character. And the idea is maybe the same applies to pain, right? Pain maybe is just like color. We directly know we are having a color experiences, and then we have different ways of having color experiences. And we can even characterize them very nicely in a color space by having specific kind of dimensions that are called determination dimensions, like hue, saturation, and brightness, that allow us to create this space and say, all colors are within this space and only colors are within this space. And this is, so to say, if we have an experience instantiating a space in this a point in this space, then this, so to say, leads to us having the experience, oh, I'm having a color experience. And maybe the same applies to pain. And then we can ask, okay, maybe that seems to be a very fruitful well. It's like a multiplicity of authors who are trying to go down this route. But what could such a pain space then actually look like if we want to construct it? This is what I want to address in this second step. So I think we should have maybe that's almost trivial, but I still think sometimes it's nice to make this very systematic of like, how would we go about in trying to address or developing this phenomenal space? So phenomenal space is a property space. And then first of all, we need to identify the group of data objects we're interested in. So for example, all the colors that we want to include. We need to identify properties that these data objects possess to different degrees. So in the case of colors, it would be saturation, hue, and brightness. We construct dimensions that identify these properties and that are standing then in for similarities and how the colors are experienced. So the closer together on the dimension, the more similar the experience is of these colors with respect to the property that is represented by the dimension. We can combine these dimensions into a more complex property space. And then we can say that all the different data objects have an individual point, or so to say, a particular point they inhabit within this kind of space. And if we then in the end can also say, okay, if all and only data objects of the certain kind are located within this property space, then this space provides, in fact, the necessary and sufficient conditions or properties for the group of data objects. So what makes a color experience a color experience? Oh, it's because it is phenomenologically experienced as having this coordinate point in a phenomenal space of colors. And of course, property spaces could be in general developed for multiple different kinds of things, right? We could have property spaces for physical properties. So for example, for how similar certain stimuli are to one another. We also know neural spaces, so we can construct spaces indicating how similar certain data objects are with respect to the neural processing related to it. We know that there are spaces related to conceptual, right? How close or similar concepts are to one another. So we can think about the similarities in semantic meaning and so on. And a couple of this has in fact also been developed for pain. So and we will also talk about this a bit later. I think what I really want to emphasize when I talk here about a phenomenal space for pain, it's really just about how similar the experience of pain are in terms of how we experience them, independent, for example, of how similar the neural processing it, or how similar, for example, they are with relation to the stimuli causing them. It's really just about the phenomenal experience and how similar or dissimilar they are. Now, why is it useful to think of pain in terms maybe of construction of such a phenomenal space? So I think the first is, and I think I motivated this, that people like defenders of the determinant view, they often say something along these lines, right? There should be a phenomenal space for pain because they make all these analogies to colors where we obviously have this color space. But they never tell us what this pain space might actually look like. And then I think it's just like it's a valuable project to maybe think about like, okay, let's take this as a hypothesis that should be tested. Then what could this space actually look like? But we also see, for example, in psychology or neuroscience, when people are trying to construct spaces for similarity, for example, in the neural process of pain, or for example, with relation to the stimuli of pain, then they are quite often assuming or saying, oh, it would be so interesting to see how similar they are in terms of like if pains that are more similar in neural processing are also more similar in their phenomenal experience, right? But if we want to do this kind of mapping, we first need to have this phenomenal space that we can then, so to say, map to other spaces. For instance, when it comes to psychophysical correspondences, whether this is in terms of like causing stimuli or neural processes. So I think it's just like it's an interesting project to go with. So I think that here the construction of a multidimensional phenomenal space would allow us to model the phenomenal complexity and variation of pains more systematically, and then also use this to address the issue of orthodoxy of simplicity, because this is, for the philosophy of mind at least, the most intense debate going on right now. Now, how could we construct such a space? I think the first decision we have to make is like, how do we distinguish the group of things we are interested in and what kind of descriptions do we use for it? And maybe with respect to colors, this seems to be more straightforward, but with respect to pain, it's not this easy to decide. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with a McGinn pain questionnaire, but I want to say that this is not unproblematic, right? I take this as a starting point because it's the best database we have. But for example, it's not clear whether the McGinn pain questionnaire is really like interculturally sensitive enough. So it might be that in different cultures, we find different descriptions, and we will have to check in the end whether the phenomenal space we come up with is really a universal phenomenal space. So we should be aware of this kind of limitations. And I think we should also be aware of the limitations that this is mostly a description that is helpful for acute episodic pain. So we see, for example, that chronic pain patients often use other words to describe their experience of pain than acute pain patients do. And often they rather refer, for example, also to the impact that the experiences of pain are having to their general life. So again, maybe all pains might in the end fit into this phenomenal space, but we should be careful in saying this is like a full description of the entire phenomenology of pains, right? So maybe there's more to having phenomenal experiences of pain than what might be captured in the simplistic sensory and affective aspects. But as I said, it's the best thing, it's the best starting point we have while keeping these limitations in the back of our mind. So I started just looking at all these different kinds of adjectives that they have there and trying to follow certain rules. So to think about, okay, the coordinate points on a dimension should represent different degrees to which panes possess such property, and different values on dimensions should then also represent minimal subjectively experienceable differences in their phenomenal properties. And a pane should be able to instantiate a value on each dimension at the same time. So if we construct our dimensions, then it should not be the case that we have values on these dimensions that exclude each other, so that we would have, if we now construct our pane space, for example, have holes in it, right? So we want that all of these different regions of the pane space could actually be instantiated by different cases. Maybe they are not, but this should be then just a contingent fact of like nature and not, so to say, fact of constructing the space. So, for example, if you look at group 7, here we have hot, burning, scalding, and searing, then it seems that these are different intensities of like how things can be experienced as like being of high temperature. Then we should not have like different dimensions on one which is hot and on the other which is searing, because it seems to be that these are, you don't experience something as hot and searing at the same time, but they should be like different values on one dimension, for example. Further, I think that a pane should only instantiate one value on each dimension, because otherwise the dimension characterizes more than one property. This means, again, like you want to prevent that you have like properties that are actually describing different kinds of values on one dimension is scattered across different dimensions, and that they, of course, not excluding each other. And we should only introduce dimensions if needed. So if one change on a dimension is leading automatically to the exact same change on another dimension, then maybe we could collapse them. Of course, it is to be expected that change on one dimension might potentially also lead to changes on another dimension, but at least we want to have, it's always the exact same change. Then maybe we just have, so to say, two descriptors for the same value on one dimension. We want to include this as well. So we want to have as little dimensions as needed and as much as, as little as possible and as much as needed. This is the kind of rule I try to implement. And this is the very first, so to say, suggestions I came up with. I write also preliminary lists because I actually think that this is something that should be very much up for debate. Like, are these really the best dimensions? Is something maybe missed there? So I think one thing that needs, of course, to be included is location. So this is quite interesting because it's quite different than what we have in color spaces, for example. But it seems to be pain experiences necessarily have some kind of like bodily locations in which they are experienced that need to be covered in some sense. Then we seem to have like a sensory category. And I think we definitely need something like a temperature dimension where we go, for example, from freezing, cold or chilling experiences over to warm, burning, searing and so on at the other side at the extreme. Then something that I called forced application. So from force inwards pushing, like crunching, cramping and pushing to, so to say, on the other spectrum, force outward pulling, where we then have rather adjectives like drawing and wrenching. And something that in analogy to the color space, I called saturation. So something going from being aching, doing soul to rather like sharp piercing or lengthening, which seems to be like I called this saturation because I thought it's best capturing what this should be. And we seem to need to capture, so to say, this affective category, which is often associated with a negative hedonic tone, also then coming in different degrees from inconvenient, unpleasant, and awful. The interesting thing is that it's not entirely clear how it relates to the motivational aspects. That might be one aspect to discuss. And that it's only including, so to say, one side. So a lot of people have said that pain has necessarily an unpleasant aspect to it, right? So it's not that it's like, oh, it has an affective tone and either it's positive or negative. No, it seems to be we are only pushing pains and say they are on this side of the spectrum. Like it's only the negative hedonic tone that seems to be of relevance when we are characterizing the pain space, which is also, it's just different from the sensory categories that I've presented. So let's work with this, right? And I'm, like I said, I'm aware, happy to discuss whether this is actually the best characterization, that we're starting with the McGill pain questionnaire. That's a suggestion for how this pain space might look like. But now we can, of course, ask, like, is this really a pain space? Because pain space means more than to say, oh, we constructed a space in which pains are typically located. So the big problem or the big question is, especially if we really want to say it's not just a space for pain experience, but a pain space, then it means that it incorporates all data objects of the relevant kinds. And it also means that it's inhabited inclusively by data objects of the relevant kind. So it's only inhabited by pain experiences. Only then we can sort of say speak of this space being a pain space, because this exactly seems to be fulfilled in the case of colors, right? The color space, all colors are located in the color space, and only colors are located in the color space. That's what makes it, so to say, the necessary and sufficient condition for having a color experience. It's like you have an experience with properties located in this particular kind of phenomenal space. And if we want to say the same for pain, this properties needs to be fulfilled as well. So why is this relevant? So first of all, I think, again, it's not no pain qualities. There are no specific point in the coordinate point of what I just presented can be identical to the pain quality. If at all there is a way of making the determinable view work, then only if this is a pain space, right? It is then that being located in this pain space. And this is what a couple of people like, I think Klein, also Craig and Coleman seem to indicate, at least in some of their phrasings. So, okay, then we say, okay, we might think of the phenomenal quality of pain as a determinable of which each case is a determinant varying along the introduced determination dimensions. This is then only how we can make this work. That's, I think, why it's quite relevant to ask this question of whether it's a pain space. And let's first talk about necessity. So is this a space in which all pains are located, in fact? So I think the easiest way to phrase this is to say that if a subject stops experiencing pain when a certain phenomenal property P is blocked, all other things being equal, then we can say it's necessary for the emergence of pain, right? Blocked is just instantiating no value on the respective dimension. And the other way around, we can just ask, is a property, if a property is not necessary, if we have a case of pain that instantiates no value on the respective dimensions, or could we think about the pain space and just ripping out one of the dimensions and nothing is changed, so to say, that we still have this pain space? And I think that a couple of people have actually discussed these kind of cases. It's often called dissociative cases, or in general, it would be a counterexample to the idea of a pain space. And I think rarely people have addressed the question of the sensory aspect. So most people say, okay, there's something unique in the sensation related to pain and that these sensory aspects are somehow always present. But there are a few authors like Plona who have tried to show that certain people with brain lesions have, so to say, the pain affective unpleasantness that's painful still, but that what it's missing is the sensory aspect. The problem is that these cases are not really convincing, because what's happening in this case is that the people give very vague descriptions. So they are no longer able to say like, oh, my pain is here, but they say it's somehow here, for example, or that they not say, oh, it has this specific kind of quality, but it's a little bit more vague. But you could still say, oh, it's just that they have no like very specific space in the pain space. It's just that it's a little bit more vague region in which they are maybe phenomenologically located. So I don't think that's a really good counter argument we're having here. One might, of course, ask, like, is every pain really experienced along a temporal dimension, for example, or along a fourth dimension? I think especially when it comes to the fourth application, I think it's quite convincing, all the saturation, that this is in fact always the case for all pains, of course, to different degrees, but that this might be still kind of convincing. I think, in fact, most of the counterexamples that are discussed concern the question whether there can be pains that are not unpleasant. I think masochistic pains has been long discussed, though I have the feeling the discussion right now is to say, yeah, these pains are still unpleasant. There's just an additional second order pleasantness associated with them. But I think for still right now, the example of pain as symbolia is really sticking with philosophers. There's so many papers in philosophy of pain on pain as symbolia, which is a quite rare condition where it seems to be that patients can very well report on all sensory aspects of their pain. They also report this to be a case of pain, but they don't seem to feel any form of unpleasantness. They don't react normally to pain-related threats, for example. Also here, I'm just briefly indicating this, especially in the work of Griffith and Kind. They have very nicely shown how much methodological problems there are in the setup of these experiments that are, or the questions that have been done in relation to pain as symbolic patients. It's not even clear whether this is like a unique phenomena. So, for example, if you have pain as symbolic patients and you just turn up the stimuli, at some point they still show affective reactions. So maybe they just have a diminished affective reaction. But I just think, like in general, maybe I'm biased here because I worked on that, and sometimes it's really hard to see the other side. But I think that there's no real convincing case to show me, or at least me, that there is like cases of pain which do not score on the indicated sensory and affective dimensions. So maybe the space provided is a space in which all pains are located. I think the more interesting question is the question of sufficiency. So if we can identify a case in which this phenomenal property that we're interested in, or even the entire property space, right, there's something that's scoring on this that is not a case of pain, then it cannot be sufficient. And I think that especially here, when we are interested in this entire space, this is also what we're asking, like, is this entire space maybe inhabited by cases that are not pains? And I think there might be. So especially what's sometimes clustered as homeostatic bodily sensations. So this is also itch, hunger, thirst, or dyspnea. So these are all bodily sensations that normally have a negative affective tone. So there's also, of course, a few positively associated or like positively balanced bodily sensations, but the group we are focusing on here are those that are typically also described as unpleasant to different degrees. And they might also score on at least some of these sensory dimensions. And of course, it's then questionable whether they actually do on all of them. But I think when we think about dyspnea, for example, so the inability to have the experience of breathing, or for instance, when we think about hunger, they also have like a force, it's like it feels like it's cramping, or it's like it's pulled inward, for example, that it can feel aching or dull, right? So there's certain kind of already like this force applications and also the saturation dimension that we use the same adjectives to describe exactly these kinds of also unpleasantly related affective experiences. So maybe what we have created is a homeostatic bodily sensation space in which then these different kinds of negatively valenced homeostatic bodily sensations are located. Now one might say, okay, maybe, but what if we rather think about then pain not as being, so to say, associated with this entire space, but with a region in it, right? What if pain is not like color, but rather like red, and the different kind of pain experiences we have are rather like crimson and scarlet, right? So that we are just going, so to say, one level down in our grain of analysis, right? We say, okay, this entire space is inhabited by all this different kind of homeostatic sensation. I think like Gerdenfors, at least in some of this rare work that he's done of pain, he's indicating something along these lines. But we can, of course, ask whether this is a convincing solution. And so far, I think I'm not convinced. And I think this has to do with the heterogeneity of pains. So I think itch and hunger and dyspnea are like, maybe they have their own little regions, right? It seems to be that hunger more or less always feels the same in a very specific kind of sense, like which kind of sensory properties it has, for example. But with pain, pain is so diverse when we think about pains that are related to our skin, to our intestinals, headaches. They all seem to have very different kind of sensory properties and not just scoring differently on the affective dimension. And if we really want to have this region view, right, or the subspace view of pain, then we would need to show that the most extreme points at which in this space pains are located, everything between this is just inhabited by other pains, right? This would be what is necessary to really speak like of a region that we can identify with pain. And as I said, I think maybe with the other homeostatic bodily sensations, this is the case, but I think it's quite unlikely for pain given the heterogeneity. So to say, interestingly, the heterogeneity problem is quite sneaking in here again to a certain degree. Now, what kind of implications does this have? I think, first of all, the fact that we cannot identify a pain space maybe doesn't have that much big scientific implications in the sense of what we can do with this space, right? Especially when we are interested, for example, in raw psychological or neuroscientific investigations. Because I think that just in like being better in constructing this pain space and really trying out what the topology of such a pain space or phenomenal space in which pains are located might look like, could really help us to understand the complexity and heterogeneity in the phenomenal experiences of pain, as well as like non-pain phenomena, right? Maybe it's interesting to better understand which pains are more similar to itch in their phenomenal experience than they are, for example, some are more similar, for example, like hunger or dyspnea, and how, for example, certain chronic experience are more similar to chronic itches than, for example, acute pains and acute itches are similar to another. Having this kind of cases, that doesn't necessarily mean a problem. It would also account for borderline cases. So sometimes maybe there's also a phenomenal case where we're not really sure whether it's, am I hungry or do I have a stomach ache, right? That there might be borderlines in that. Now we could learn a lot of like not only looking at pain, but also how they relate phenomenologically to other non-pain experiences. And this could then maybe also help us to make this structural mapping that a lot of people are interested in. So, for example, how these phenomenal similarities relate to stimulus similarities. For instance, also know that the receptors, like itch-related receptors and pain-related receptors, are often like interacting strongly with one another. And also when it comes to neural correspondence. So, for example, how similarities in a phenomenal space might look or correspond to similarities in a neural space. Given also that, for example, not only pain, but also itch and hunger and so on are processed in the same neural matrix. That's called like the body self matrix by Meltzer, for example. So maybe this is like, maybe the result I'm giving you here is not too bad at all for a lot of these projects we are interested in. For the philosophical inquiry, you might say, okay, this is more of a problem, right? Because I try to say, okay, we don't have to throw out the orthodoxy of simplicity simply because of the heterogeneity problem, but then we need an alternative explanation. And this is what they're trying to give us, namely, okay, all pains are located in the pain space. This is how we account for the pain quality. But then it seems to be, if I'm right about what I presented here, this analogy, for example, to the color space does not hold. And it seems to be that maybe then the determinable view is not the most promising option for the orthodox view. Now, what are the alternatives? I mean, you could still go with Jennifer Korn's view, right? You could just say there is no pain quality. This is just what we have to accept, right? Maybe they are just nothing along these lines, what Kripke and Klein and so on have been looking for. Maybe this is just something we have to accept. I've been trying to come up with an alternative, and I say this very much, it's like speculations ahead, because this is, so to say, an area where I've just deep dived into, and I thought, like, if there's any kind of way in which we might make this still work, maybe the metacognitive view could help us with that. So the metacognitive view comes from a discussion, for example, around the word of Proust, Mwengo and Karava, which is like a lot about the idea of metacognitive feelings. So metacognitive feelings are understood as affective. Oh, sorry, this is like I'm sorry for that. One more, here we go. So it's very much with the idea that metacognitive feelings are affective states. So that's a little bit like cognitive here is maybe a bit confusing, but I'm going to explain why it's called metacognitive. But it's mostly about affective states having certain kind of feeling to it, and that they arise from psychological mechanisms monitoring other mental states. So, for example, the feeling of knowing something, the feeling of forgetting something, the feeling of, oh, this is new to me, right? The feelings of uncertainty. These are certain kinds of feelings with certain qualitative properties. And they emerge as we are, so to say, that's why it's called metacognitive, monitoring other processes, comparing, for example, similarities in other kinds of processes. And my idea is here, maybe pains are glued together in introspection by some kind of metacognitive feeling of familiarity. So that certain kind, like two instances of experiences we experience them as pain because there's a metacognitive feeling of that these belong into a similar category of things to us. So it is monitoring the similarities and dissimilarities of bodily feelings. Some of them are identified then as instances of the same family of experiences, namely pains. And often the idea is that metacognitive feelings are useful because they allow us to shortcut, so to say, to directly identify things, for example, as belonging together. We don't need to go like self-reflective, mind-reading processes of like, oh, is this really the same experience that I had yesterday? And like, no, it's like, this is a pain. This is the same pain you had yesterday. And this is then helping us, so to say, to choose actions that are more fitting for the situation we have. Of course, it's a big question, what are the right psychological mechanisms, right? So which are the psychological mechanisms that are inducing then these feelings of familiarity? Maybe it's in some cases like really the phenomenal similarity, right? That we have maybe certain spaces in the phenomenal space where really only pains are related and we experience them as more family to one another. Maybe in other cases that we're tracking history of experiences, so that every day you have the same pain in your knee, and the first time you have it, and like 2 years later, their phenomenal properties is completely different, but you still experience them as being the same pain because of these different kinds of like tracking in your history. So that there's a mysterious effect of like leading to this kind of experiences. But as I said, this is definitely still speculation. And sometimes I feel that I play too much into the cards of Jennifer Cohn's of just making the point that maybe there is no pain quality. But I think what is most interesting, or what was most interesting for me about designing or thinking about this phenomenological space, is that I did so on a motivation based on these discussions in philosophy of mind. Well, in the end, I think most people that were interested in it, like for example, Sascha Fink, rather people were coming from philosophy of neuroscience. So we're thinking about how these phenomenological spaces can then actually be used to do something with this in relation to, for example, neuroscience, or thinking about psychophysical correspondences. And thank you very much for your attention. Sorry so much for the technical issues that have just disappeared, or my slides disappeared. I hope that it nonetheless was possible to follow, and I'm looking very much forward to your question.
Thank you very much.